Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guest panelists for today. First, we have Ms. Carmela Monk Crawford, who's the editor of Message Magazine. We have Melissa Reed, who's the Director of Government Affairs for the North American Division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We also have with us Ms. Bettina Krause, the editor of Liberty Magazine, and we have Ms. Jennifer Woods, who's the General Counsel and Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Lake Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Ladies, great having you here and looking forward to our conversation today. I was recently looking at an article. It was talking about Christian groups that were subverting religious liberty of other Christians. The Italian Supreme Court seems to be engaged in a harassment of an evangelical church, and that serves as a stark reminder that when you have certain religious groups that are in dominant positions, that they can easily be looking for other ways where they end up hurting other religious groups. For nearly a decade, Breccia di Roma, an evangelical congregation in Rome, have been embroiled in a legal battle with the tax authorities in Italy because of an issue regarding the legitimacy of their place of worship. The dispute kind of revolves around the fact that there is what we would call a storefront property that is being used as a church, and therefore the exemptions that they would like to gain seem to be pushed back on, quote unquote, by the Italian government, and therefore the courts are looking to do something a little bit different. Bettina, as we think about what goes on from a worldwide basis as it relates to religious freedom and protection of houses of worship, so many times we think in America, well, that's issues that happen someplace else. But I've also heard about issues where there were concerns about what could be deemed a house of worship, even in America. And the fact of the matter is sometimes what's going on in somebody else's backyard may find itself happening in your backyard. As somebody who has looked at international freedom and religious issues from an international perspective for many years, how do we juxtapose what's going on here and understanding who may be right and who may be wrong?
This is such an odd case. This is a Catholic majority country, and it seems to be treating poorly a group of evangelical Christians. And so you'd say, why? If you work in the area of international religious advocacy, freedom advocacy, there's two things you learn very quickly. The first is that every religious group is a minority somewhere and is persecuted. And the second is that every religious group is also likely to be in a majority somewhere else, and often they're oppressors in that context. The other thing you also learn very quickly is that constitutional protections around religious freedom sometimes don't mean a lot at all. And so you see in this particular case, the Italian Constitution clearly has protections for religious freedom, but they are not being enforced in a way that provides, equal treatment for another Christian denomination.
No, Carmela, obviously Catholicism is the huge, what I would call religious and dominant religious force in Italy. But it seems as though if you fall outside of that category, maybe even the courts aren't there to protect you from what's going on in this particular matter.
That's right. What I find interesting is that many people operate. Well, here in the United States, how many times have you been down the streets and you've seen storefront places of worship, houses of worship everywhere? This is what I see all the time, small towns, big cities, storefront houses of worship. Some are more spare, some are more adorned and beautiful. The question is, what makes a house of worship and who gets to decide that? And that's exactly the issue here in Italy. In this case, the tax authority and the court decided what is a house of worship, and they decided on the style of worship. And so then here you have a Protestant evangelical group that has a very spare space, one that is multifunctional and multi-purpose in nature, and that doesn't fit the Catholic style, that doesn't fit even maybe a Jewish or a Muslim tradition. but this is theirs. Who gets to decide how you worship and what you worship in?
Orlin, if we weren't seeing, a faith tradition's rights infringed upon, it would actually be kind of an amusing case in that, only in Italy, right, which is like the fashion capital of the world, and it's known for its beautiful architecture and empty churches, right? And so now you have a plain nondescript storefront church that seems to be thriving, and yet they're being discriminated against because evidently not an appropriate standard or aesthetic. And so as Bettina said, I think this is a real opportunity. She pointed out, everywhere there are different majorities, religious majorities everywhere, and oftentimes in other places they're a religious minority. And I feel like this is a real opportunity for the faith community, the international faith community, to come together as one and stand up for the rights of this evangelical congregation, because it may not be affecting them in this particular situation, but we know that it very easily could in another environment, or even in that environment in a different manner, besides the fact that it's the right thing to do. So that's what I'd love to see. I feel like this is an opportunity for the international religious freedom community to rally together and to really put pressure on the Italian government to appropriately engage with this congregation.
Jennifer, some people will say, well, this is something that's going on from a cultural bias standpoint in Italy, but we could never imagine that happening here where we live. And then you start hearing about, well, you may have Supreme Court justices who go out and have conversations where it's pretty clear their own cultural biases seem to be on display when they go out to speak. And it begs the question, is it on display when they're actually ruling and making decisions? And we're looking at a situation here where clearly one Christian group believes that another Christian group does not have, and I love the term, the markings of a religious, building, and therefore, I don't know, lack of a cross, who knows what it is, but a court is making this decision. That seems to be problematic and where a lot of the world may be going.
Yeah, and I think, going back to something Bettina said, it's one thing to have laws on the books protecting religious freedom, but it's another thing as far as how those laws are actually applied, right? Here they had laws on the books. And in the US, we have laws on the books that give robust protection for freedom of religion. But how those laws are applied are not always equal across the board. We see minority faiths that have to prove sometimes that they are, in fact, legitimate religions, whereas some faiths are automatically favored. So, you can really tell a lot about how much we actually value this concept of religious liberty and religious freedom based on how we treat our minority religions and those that are less well understood and much less well known.
Jennifer has put it just so beautifully because, for instance, Native American religions here in America have traditionally found it very hard to access equal protection for religious freedom. Why? Because their forms of worship don't fit naturally within our sort of Judeo-Christian understanding of what a worship looks like. So their space for their worship may be part of a landscape rather than a church, or their sacrament may be a hallucinogenic drug rather than sacramental wine. And so we see what is happening in Italy with these two Christian denominations. We see it also happening here. And I think it reminds us that we ourselves can be blind to the needs of religious minorities, as Jennifer pointed out.
Can I just say also that even the name, I don't put it past this small congregation for taking a stand. We have to say, first of all, they're taking a stand is going to cost them something. They've got to pay back taxes and taxes going forward because they have not been recognized as a tax-exempt house of worship. So they are taking a stand. But it also looks they're taking a philosophical and spiritual or religious stand just just in their very name, breach of Rome. They wanted this smoke and they got it. And sometimes taking a stand requires that. I don't agree with the court in this situation. I don't agree with the tax authority in this situation. It's not an objective set of factors that create a house of worship or religious experience. We define it here, and that's something that we have to hold on to. It is up to a person's conscience and interrelation with their view of the divine in their life.
You know what's ironic about a lot of this is that for a very long time, the Catholic Church, when they were kind of in its formation stages, used to utilize their buildings to allow other churches to use their buildings, and they in turn would kind of go anywhere and create their own religious environment that sometimes did not have the markings. But for some reason, because the markings are from somebody else that you get a chance to make a decision on, it seems to be a problem. But the question I guess I'm really trying to get to is, who gets to determine who's either religious enough or looks religious enough? And it seems as though the courts and the tax authority here, but many will say in America, that the courts are getting ready to determine how religious we are and who is religious enough. And as a result thereof, your rights could be either protected or harmed as a result thereof. So when you see this, Melissa, and you think about some of the work that you do, that seems to be where the real confusion is. Somebody other than you is telling you how religious you are.
Yeah, and as my fellow panelist alluded to, we are seeing here in the United States things that have been very distinct as far as the government not defining a religious tenet or a component of a faith tradition or the religiosity of an individual. We are seeing gradually change there, right? Where the court or the government is feeling more and more comfortable in making that determination, which again is completely wrong. But I think this is absolutely a harbinger of what we can expect to continue to see here at home.
You know, Bettina, as you've traveled around the world and seen other religious groups, and we're just talking about activities here in Europe, it just seems as you get to other continents like Asia and the continent of Africa, that you even see even more of this type of activity taking place. You don't look like me, you don't sound like me, and from a religious perspective, this can't be real. I mean, this seems to be a problem that we're dealing with on a worldwide basis, and it seems as though you've got to speak up from a worldwide basis if there's ever going to be change, or maybe I should just step out and let cultural activities, carry the day.
Orlin, you're absolutely right. We are seeing it on an international basis, and it is usually within the context of a religion that is a majority within a particular country. So, one of the most interesting cases I came across was Egypt. It's a majority Muslim country. They have a small Coptic Christian group there as well, which is small and it's kind of tolerated, but it is discriminated against by the majority religion. But then there's an even smaller Christian group of Christian denominations, evangelical Christians, and the Coptics discriminate against that group. And so you have this sort of chain reaction, which says to me, Orlin, that this is human nature. We like to say religious freedom for me, but not for thee. This is sort of a reflexive stance that we take as humans. We have to recognize what we're doing, and we have to take steps to overcome that.
And it comes right back to the tagline of our show: is your faith shaping your politics, or is your politics starting to shape your faith? And that's the big question we have to ask ourselves. There's a case out there that's called Lowe versus Jett, and it's a case that's taking place in Minnesota, where the state created the Post Secondary Enrollment Options, a program that's put in place nearly 40 years ago, which was to encourage and enable high school students to earn college credit and tuition free. Since 1985, the program has allowed thousands of students to enroll at universities throughout the state and to get a head start in higher education without having to foot the bill. But recently, Minnesota amended this particular statute to strip religious universities of their eligibility in the program if they have any kind of statement of faith that is required of the students. It's quite interesting when you take a look at this case, because the governor who actually moved forward on this was Governor Tim Walz, who currently right now is the Democratic nominee to be Vice President of the United States. And we now see that he was in the position to be able to carve out some specific institutions. And there were two top-notch schools in the state, the University of Northwestern and Crown College, that basically had a quote-unquote Christian component, and as a result thereof, they've been stripped out of the program. You know, Jennifer, when you take a look at the legal requirements of what's taking place here, and on one hand, you have a group that says, well, if taxpayer dollars are involved, religious institutions, including their universities, should be out. But on the other hand, it says, but if this is something that's being made available, why should religious institutions be carved out? You know, when you take a look at this and you see the governor of Minnesota and you see some of the politics that's happening here, it makes you wonder, is this a statement regarding how one feels, maybe from a religious perspective, or is this something where you're just representing what your public is looking to see, and as a result thereof, this is just letting the chips fall where they may?
You know, Orlin, I've really been grappling with this particular case, because on one hand, you're right, you have people saying, hey, people shouldn't be denied going to school they want to go to just because it's religious in nature. And that's a compelling argument. But on the other hand, there's a fact that this is public funds, right? And it's not that the state is saying that you can't go to these schools, but it is laying out some ground rules as far as what the schools have to abide by to get this funding. And it really made me think back to Carson v. Macon, right? Where on the one hand, they say, we should all have access. If this is public funding and it's going to public and private institutions, don't treat religion any differently. Mm-hmm. And in the post Carson v. Macon world, now we're seeing the religious schools saying, hey, also don't apply these anti-discrimination regulations to us. So I kind of see it in some ways as religious institutions wanting their cake and eating it too, because they're saying we want the public funding, but we don't want to abide by the rules of the state. And the thing is, the state gets to make the rules on some of these things, right? And if we don't want to abide by those regulations, then maybe we shouldn't be in those spaces. So I really am grappling with this one a little bit.
So, Orlin, I think I'm looking at it from a little different perspective as far as it's my understanding that this is actually funds that are they're a lot like grants, right? They're not actually going to the institution, they're going to the families for them to take them to the institution. And if that's the situation, I look at it in a situation of you can't penalize a family for having religious values and wanting to take the money that the government is giving to them to a religious institution. So I think that's something to consider. You know, we certainly see that where, other Christian colleges and universities would not exist were not students bringing their grant and loan money to those higher education institutes. I think also it's important to recognize this for what it is, right? Times have changed since 1985 as far as the view of Christianity in our nation, right? And so what was once popular before, these schools have been accepting this money, Christian schools have been participating in this program since 1980 or 85. And yet in 2023, the governor decided that this is no longer appropriate. And to me, the only thing that I'm recognizing is that times have changed as far as the way that Christianity is viewed.
No, Carmela, they're basically saying that if you're part of an institution where they ask you to attend and adhere to that institution's religious beliefs, then that basically puts them out of the ability to be able to be involved with this program. But let's just say that the funding went directly to the school. Let's say it didn't go directly to the parents or however the program would work. Does it change a whole lot of the whole concept? Because it's clear that this is something for universities. So it's clear that the long run, where it's going to end up. I guess what I'm grappling with is the idea of how do you know when you've gone too far? It's on one hand, they're saying that, well, why should you exclude a religious university just because we're religious? But on the other hand, it's also saying, but you're a religious university and therefore just your nomenclature puts you in an exclusionary position. Is there a way to basically, be on both sides of the fence on this and still maybe find a happy medium?
The short answer to that, Orlin, is I don't know. I don't know. I don't think anybody else knows, because the more we talk about this, the more confusing it is. When I went to school, I went to a private Christian college and I received Pell Grants. That's government funding, right?
No question.
But there was no statement of faith that allowed, that's the issue here. You want the funds, but you also want the students who receive the public funds to agree or abide by a statement of faith. And then to get those funds, that's the pivot point. That is the establishment of the religion. That is enforcing or supporting a religion. And that's where, for me, I kind of draw the line. No, these students, the school wasn't stripped of this. The school, in order to be eligible, you don't have this kind of a marker or a litmus test. No, students are not disadvantaged. You can go to any college you want to, but if you want public funds, and you want to go to a school, it can't be the religious school. So, I, as a person who had that benefit of getting the public funds, it is difficult, but there was no statement of faith and no overall expectation. This is how we act at this campus. You want the money, but you don't want the people.
And just to add to that, there are other religious colleges and universities in Minnesota that are still eligible for this program. So it's not that they're targeting all religious institutions. It really does come down to what Carmela talked about, and that is requiring the statement of faith and the fact that students have been turned away from the program because they haven't signed on to the statement of faith in the past. So, there are other schools, other Christian schools, other religious schools that are still eligible here.
And I think that is correct. And I think, Jennifer, when you talked about Carson versus Macon and the fact that this has sort of changed the landscape around state funding for religious schools, now the Supreme Court is saying that states, once they open up a program to a similarly situated secular private school, they have to include religious schools. And so what we are seeing here, Orlin, I think, is just simply a symptom of that changed landscape. The Attorney General in Maine, when that decision came down, he got in front of the cameras and he made very clear, he said, okay, the Supreme Court says we have to fund these religious schools. If that's the way you want to play it, then we're going to go to whatever length it takes to attach strings to that funding that makes it unpalatable for those religious schools. I think what we're seeing here in this situation is simply round two of that new escalation in the culture wars. Having said all that, I am also in that position of struggling with what is the appropriate level of state funding that goes to religious schools that have a religious identity and mission that don't want to compromise that. Because at some point you have to say, I am prepared to walk away from this funding because I value my mission and my identity more than I value this funding. At some point, that is going to be necessary for religious schools. I don't think we can continue to move down this track of continually pushing the envelope of receiving, opening up that faucet of state funding for religious schools with no strings attached. That is a bridge too far, I think. This is just a really nuanced conversation. It's going to take a lot more talking, I think.
But I got to ask the question, and Melissa, I'll let you jump in on this. A lot of this seems to boil down to there are many religious institutions and some of these universities that if they weren't in a position to allow their students, for example, to take Pell Grants and things of that nature, some of those institutions would close because there wouldn't be enough funding in place to keep those institutions moving forward. So it seems as though the struggle is when you are looking from a societal standpoint, and let's say you're not a religious person, but you look at an organization that, for all intents and purposes, has been empowered to discriminate in many ways. But it seems like it almost looks like they want their cake and eat it too. Leave me alone so I can do whatever I want to do. Oh, by the way, if you're handing out free money, not only do I want to be online, sometimes I'm knocking you over to be first online to get there. And that seems to be the struggle, Melissa, is what it looks like to many people.
You're right, Orlin, as far as sort of just the real vulnerability of higher ed and the higher Christian ed. As you know, the Seventh-day Adventist Church has a college and university system. And it's been a couple of years since I've looked at the numbers, but I believe it was most of the majority of the schools were in the 70 to 80% range as far as the percentage of students who were attending because they were receiving grants and or loans. And so I really feel like sort of that point that Bettina was talking about, we're about to reach, I think we were like way past it. I think it's already happened. And so I recognize and agree with the principle that we should be able to make those sacrifices. But I also know that college tuition has just exponentially, since I went to school, since my parents went to school, it really is not, we're no longer in a situation where you can work really hard in the summer as a student and then be able to pay off your tuition for the next year. Like that just isn't the situation. And so it does seem like, and then, I think about, minorities wanting, like, are you discriminating against a population group that wants to attend? And when I talk about minority, I'm talking about the lower income as well, that this may be their only opportunity to be able to attend. And now because of the financial situation, to attend a school which is part of their faith tradition, part of their faith identity, and you're saying that you can't attend that school because, I think we're going to see a disproportionate consequences on these lower income families.
No, Melissa, I'm going to let that be the last word on this, but we're starting to realize that when we try to juxtapose the idea of higher education and religion and government funding, that's a combination that at some point, and I think the term that was used is muddy. And I don't know if you will ever be able to make it clear, because I think it's just going to be one of those nuanced conversations that may never have a perfect answer. Hey, Jennifer, tell me something I don't know.
Sure. So since we were talking about Rome earlier, did you know that Rome hosts more than 4,000 feral cat colonies? And in fact, that it has officially declared its feral cats a biocultural heritage, and they have legally protected status in the city.
I'm glad I didn't know that. Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
Well, Orlin, did you know that, dare I say this, that Minnesota is weird? It actually has the only Spam museum in the world dedicated to canned meat.
No, I didn't. Carmela, tell me something I don't know.
Well, in light of the conversation we had today regarding publicly funded schools, I was happy to see recently that the Oklahoma Supreme Court said no on the nation's first publicly funded religious school.
Wow. Melissa, tell me something I don't know.
Sure. We'll be looking at that appropriate balance between the government and the educational system. Going back to Italy, did you know, Orlin, that an agreement with the Holy See provides the Catholic Church to select teachers paid by the state to provide instruction in weekly, quote, hours of religion, courses that are taught in Italian public schools?
Did not know that. Ladies, this was great as usual. Enjoyed all of the stuff that we talked about today. Thanks again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.